our latest webinar, which is on 1823, the Monroe Doctrine and the Foundations of American Foreign Policy. For the next 90 minutes, I'm delighted to have three speakers, whom I will say very briefly, but more of their CVs and publications ought to appear in the chat button below. Dr. John Grant, who is an associate professor and chair of the Department of Politics at Hillsdale College. Dr. Brooke Poston, who is associate professor of history at the Stephen F. Austin State University. And Dr. Jay Sexton, who is the Rich and Nancy Kinder Chair in Constitutional Democracy and professor of history at the University of Missouri. They all have distinguished publications, all of them bearing upon our topic. What we're going to be doing is having each of them speak in alphabetical order by last name for perhaps 12 to 14 minutes. We'll then have a guided Q&A and discussion where I will feel free to contribute some questions, but ideally you, the audience, will be passing in questions which either I can pass on or the panelists can answer. Please put them into the chat or the Q&A buttons. They're at the bottom of the Zoom panel. Please put them in. Your questions will be answered. If not during the session, then afterwards, you can send any questions you want that weren't answered, send to me afterwards, randall@nas.org. I will then forward them to the panelists so that they can answer you afterwards. I will also say this is being recorded and will go up on the National Association of Scholars YouTube channel within 24 hours. It'll be available for posterity forever for both the panelists and any audience. You will be able to hear this. So without further ado, may I please ask Professor Grant?
Thank you, David, and thank you for having me. I'm going to talk about spend most of my time talking about the later transformation and relevance of the Monroe Doctrine rather than the original. I think this worked well once I saw who the other panelists were, who have done a lot of great work, but great work on you might say, the Monroe Doctrine and its early history. So I'll say a little bit about the original doctrine, sort of situated in relation to later American political history. I understand the Monroe Doctrine to be a policy application relating to the general principles of the American founding, and especially if we think about the phrase in the Declaration of Independence about separate and equal nations. And really quickly, equal, that's pretty obvious. They're not to judge each other, or morally equal, not to judge each other, dominate each other, et cetera, et cetera. But also separate, meaning in terms separate business. They have, of course, in international affairs, they relate to each other, but their domestic affairs are not related. There's not politically connected, if we used George Washington's phrase from the farewell address. And I think you see this in the Monroe Doctrine. So very famously, the doctrine says, the European powers should not attempt to establish future colonies or reestablish colonies in the Americas. And the reason given is especially their different political systems, meaning their non-republican character. There would be clashes if they were to do that. And so you have an openness about the problem of different systems. Not that the Europeans were all exactly the same, but could all be put in the same rough category by Americans of the time. But you have no demand that the Europeans change or expectation even by that point, that the Europeans would change to our system. One of the other ways you see this is in the doctrine, Monroe, Adams declare that the de facto governments of Europe the de facto governments anywhere are the legitimate governments. You're not an illegitimate government simply you don't live up to our principles. Now, obviously, this is very different from our orientation in the last 100 or so years, especially after Woodrow Wilson. So we wish in the doctrine for a Greek independence, but we don't denounce Ottoman tyranny, demand that other nations intervene or threaten intervention on our own part. We also openly state we will not intervene in European affairs that relate solely to themselves, including their wars. We defend our rights, Monroe says, when we are attacked or threatened. That's it. And of course, the statement relates to our, what we would call now our near abroad, where it's said to be concerned, obviously should be more concerned with what's happening near to us rather than what's far away. Another thing that I think we'll see has changed, or think about briefly can see has changed. The other countries of America, the Americas, are not made, they're still separate and equal from us. And this, I think, also changes with the Roosevelt corollary. They're not subordinate to us or to be judged by us. The Americas are not a U.S. protectorate. Of course, in protectorate means you're not really independent. You're depending, at least for defense in some way, on a foreign power. And if we turn to just think about, so I'm talking about these exemplifying larger strains of thought is what and I think the Monroe Doctrine, in the way I've been describing it, exemplifies the general approach to American foreign policy taken not univocally, but mostly until the Spanish-American War. With the Roosevelt corollary, you see a major change, which is caught up with these other changes that are happening, away from the idea that nations are separate and equal. And I'm thinking especially of Roosevelt's fourth annual message here. If we judge a nation of the Americas exhibits chronic impotence or uncivilized behavior in their internal affairs, if that poses a threat, say, of inviting European intervention to repay debts or something like that, we may intervene. So you see still a tie to national defense, the idea, well, it would be a threat if a European power moved into some area of the Americas. They haven't hitherto been, but the emphasis on looking at the domestic and judging the domestic state, including the level of civilization of other American powers, is a novelty. And this really makes the entire Americas a sort of potential U.S. protectorate, not really independent or equal or separate even in their affairs. And in the context of what else TR says in this message, we need to aim at establishing the peace of justice throughout the world. And there's nothing like that in the original doctrine, of course. He talks about an international police power in cases of disorder, impotence, and chronic wrongdoing. First, we should improve ourselves at home, but intervention is possible when extreme cases of intolerable conditions manifest themselves. And he mentions Cuba as an example, the Spanish in Cuba. Meaning conceiving our war with Spain and occupation of that country as a humanitarian endeavor. And the Platt Amendment is also held up as a good model, which of course officially makes Cuba a dependent country of the U.S. Independent except when we say, no, you can't do this, If looking at the rest of the message, there's a lot in there about, and I was really struck by this time thinking about this, a lot of comments about the internal affairs of other countries, the Turks' treatment of Armenians, the Russian treatment of Jews, that we have a stance on, that we're looking to see if you're civilized, and you really should be. And of course, TR had a lot to say about this in other places, such as, I think a great example of this, for anybody who hasn't looked into this a lot on their own already, is his speech, Expansion and Peace, where the civilized nations of the world, like America, the other great Western powers, need to expand and dominate the rest of the world to uplift them into civilization so that you can have peace, the peace of righteousness, the just peace he talks about here also in his message. you see very, very great difference from the earlier attitude, which is mirrored in a lot of our other policies of the time, especially relating to the Spanish-American War and later the World Wars, of course. But moving forward, you have to wonder, and even within Roosevelt's message, does the Monroe Doctrine make any sense when you're concerned about Armenia in a serious way? And this becomes very obvious, by the time you get to Woodrow Wilson and Versailles, when you have a desire for a universal democratic order, if the thought that this should be instantiated, why would you have a particular concern for your near abroad or particular rights in your near abroad? I think it's very, very much the case that by the time we get to World War II, I'm thinking of just the simple statement of the four freedoms, which are in the Atlantic Charter, for instance, but FDR, Churchill, but particularly FDR, laying out as our war aims the production of the four freedoms should be instantiated everywhere in the world. He repeats that many times, and so it's not really possible to have nations can't really be separate and equal. Their affairs aren't, that what happens in one nation might affect another. And of course, there's all sorts of arguments for why that has to be that way. But, given events in the last 100 years, but I think it's also pretty obvious how far that is from the original understanding of the Monroe Doctrine. Okay, I'll stop there.
Thank you. We'll go on then to Professor Poston.
Thanks, David. As kind of John alluded to a little bit, I kind of go the other way with Monroe. I go kind of up to Monroe. So I'm kind of the earliest of the three, I think, when it comes to looking at foreign policy. But for today, I'm actually going to start kind of at the end of Monroe's life and his retirement. If you were to just read a little bit about Monroe's retirement, you'd see it doesn't look particularly happy. He had about 6 years after he left the presidency, 1825 to 1831, and those years were filled with various headaches and heartaches. In terms of headaches, he was broke. He spent almost the whole of his 6 years asking Congress for money, which had to be humiliating for an ex-president. He was also brought into political partisanship during the Jacksonian era, which had to be irritating for the guy who wanted, parties to go away and wanted the era of good feelings. And then finally, in terms of heartache, his wife died in 1830, and he had to leave Virginia and live out the rest of his last year of life because of his terrible health in New York. Now, despite that, Monroe stayed pretty optimistic through these 6 years. And one good example of that is in the last year or two of his life, when the French Revolution of 1830 broke out, the July Revolution. And you can see kind of the same Monroe of the 1790s, very excited about this new revolution. He says it's going to spread across the world, a new epoch for that country and the world. And you kind of look at, why is he so excited about this? And he says I think it's John Quincy Adams, because this French Revolution would occur under circumstances more favorable. That's the term he uses. And what he means is his Monroe Doctrine, because in part, Monroe looked at the Monroe Doctrine, which was not called that yet. He looked at that as a way to right the wrongs of American foreign policy, going all the way back to the French Revolution. So I'm sure we'll talk a lot about, Teddy Roosevelt and maybe Polk and various ways in which the Monroe Doctrine changed. But for Monroe, it's important to remember that he wasn't really looking forward. He was looking towards, not that he could, but it's important to keep in mind, he's kind of looking backwards toward George Washington. And so let me talk just briefly about this. I think this will probably be review for many of an audience like this, but nevertheless, 1789, there's a French Revolution, of course. Monroe and company are the Democratic Republicans are very much in favor of this French Revolution. The Federalists are a little more lukewarm and want to be impartial and neutral. Now, it's important to remember that Monroe and Jefferson don't want the United States to actively get involved in the French Revolution militarily, but as Monroe said over and over again later, he wanted to throw the moral weight of the United States on the side of the French revolutionaries. They didn't think it made any sense to declare American neutrality or impartiality in a contest between republicanism and monarchy, which, as Jay wrote in his book, they kind of saw it the same way a later generation saw the fight between capitalism and communism, which more on Jay writing that before I got a chance to. I was kind of annoyed by that, but it's a really good way to think about the way Monroe saw this. I mean, he saw this as the most important event in human history in a lot of ways, this American and French Revolution. So he also got involved in the French Revolution personally. After 1793, the war breaks out between France and much of Europe, including Great Britain. And it's Monroe who is chosen by Washington, not Washington's first choice, by the way, to go to France and become the ambassador, as they called it at the time, the minister to the French Republic. And Monroe sees his time there as a way to build a bridge between France and the United States, these sister republics, as he calls them. And it goes okay for a while. The only problem is at the same time, the United States is signing a treaty with the British, Jay's Treaty. And eventually Monroe's criticism of Jay's Treaty and his, I believe it's Edmund Randolph calls it his, sorry, excuse my French here. I mean that literally, unnecessary éclat, I think, I don't know, I don't speak French. So it's too much excessive exuberance for the French Revolution, eventually gets Monroe fired from his job in France in 1797. Monroe never forgot that. He never forgot it personally, and he could hold a grudge with the best of them. But he also never forgot it politically. In fact, by the time Napoleon had taken over in France and 1799, 1800, 1801, Monroe actually wrote this, that he thought had the United States thrown again its moral weight, its moral support behind the French Revolution, that things might have been different, that the French wouldn't have backslid towards despotism. He really believed that to some extent. So as the years go by and as the Democratic Republicans win elections and eventually Monroe moves up the political ladder, Secretary of State and then Secretary of War, then both at the same time, and then eventually president, he's put in a position as president where he can make a difference, where he can kind of right the wrongs of the past. And so I'm sure, Jay might get into this a little bit, but if we look at the immediate context of the Monroe Doctrine, in 1815, after the Battle of Waterloo, you have a situation where in Europe, there are various alliances. The Holy Alliance is probably the most famous, and they are crushing any chance of revolutionary movements from getting off the ground again. The whole idea is we're not doing that again, what happened from 1789 to 1815. And at the same time, in Latin America, all of these various countries are declaring and fighting their independence to get it from Spain. And throughout much of his administration, Monroe slowly but surely brings the United States into a position where they're going to recognize these Latin American republics. That's in 1822. And then by 1823, an opportunity arises for him to actually do something more, to right the wrongs of the 1790s, when the British offered a joint alliance to ensure that the Holy Allies, who were a little more conservative than the British were, they had a more conservative outlook in terms of monarchy than the British were interested in. Monroe was ready to jump at the chance, ready to form this alliance, going against his mentor and entangling alliances. But eventually, John Quincy Adams argues against that, and eventually the British say, well, we don't actually want to do this anymore. But Monroe and John Quincy Adams decide to pursue it anyway, unilaterally. By December of 1823, this becomes the Monroe Doctrine. But interestingly, if you look at some of the early drafts, and if you look at, well, not so much the drafts, but the arguments about the drafts in the cabinet, you find that early on, Monroe wanted a statement that would support Greek revolutionaries, that might support Spanish liberals, that would support revolution around the world. But John Quincy Adams was able to kind of talk him down. There's a great couple moments, both in the cabinet and then the next day, John Quincy Adams meets Monroe separately, individually, and tells him, look, this might, as he says in the cabinet, it's a summons to arms to Europe. It'll throw down the gauntlet. Calm down, essentially. Let's just carve out a sphere in Latin America. And eventually Monroe, he agrees to do this. He'd learned a lot politically over the years. He could be very kind of radical and extreme, unnecessary éclat, right? In his early years. In his later years, he's a little more conservative and moves a little slower. But nevertheless, by the time he creates the Monroe Doctrine, and then fast forward to near his 1830 when he's retired, and there's another revolution, he thinks, I've done it. I've created this world where revolutions in France, in Latin America, where that can thrive. And I think if we kind of step back and don't think about the way the Monroe Doctrine changed with Polk or with Teddy Roosevelt, and instead look at it from that perspective, I think Monroe would be quite proud of it, because you can see, over the long course of the last almost 200 years now, by the way, after thousands of years of monarchy, right, or a couple thousand years worth of monarchy, republicanism, Republican government, democracy, whatever you want to call it, has started, really, it was a major, I think Monroe would say that me creating these favorable circumstances helped push republicanism forward. And I think he'd be very proud of that, despite what he may or may not be proud of what happened, say, in 1898. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Professor Sexton.
Okay, hi everybody. Great to be with you, beaming in to talk to you about the Monroe Doctrine. What I want to do is I want to say just three kind of points about the Monroe Doctrine, things that you may not know, or maybe you do, maybe you haven't thought about them in that way. And then I want to say three problems with the Monroe Doctrine, or advance three sort of critiques, historically grounded critiques, not ideological or political critiques, but critiques about how the Monroe Doctrine unfolded over time, but also critiques rooted in the original text. Okay, so my first point is I really much enjoyed what Brooke just said about how there's real continuity in the political ideological meaning of Monroe's vision of how the United States related to the world, and how that was part of the struggle between republicanism and monarchy. And that's certainly in the text itself in 1823. But my first point is that nobody that drafted that text conceived of what they were doing as creating a foreign policy doctrine, or a new binding set of principles for American foreign policy. That was absolutely not the case. It's only later in the 19th century when people look back and kind of create this mythic moment for American foreign policy, something that would be like a foreign policy equivalent of, say, the founding of the nation back in the 1780s, or the Declaration of Independence in 1776. That's what they create in 1823, but the authors of that text really didn't have that in mind whatsoever. There's very little evidence that that's what they had in mind. Rather, they were responding to a series of external stimuli, external threats, the threats being mainly the fear that the conservative reactionary powers of continental Europe, led by the French, would intervene in the Western Hemisphere to reestablish Spanish or European rule throughout Latin America. That was the big threat. That was the big stimuli for the drafting of this message. But there was also concerns about Russian claims in the Pacific Northwest, that dated back a couple of years. That was very much in the air. And then, of course, there was an offer from Great Britain, the preeminent power of the time, for joint action, joint Anglo-American action. So this was a kind of crisis of the moment. The timetable was determined, interestingly, by the delivery of the annual message to Congress, from which the what we now call the Monroe Doctrine comes. You might not know this, but until the days of Woodrow Wilson, up until the 20th century, the annual message was very different from what we now call the State of the Union address, in that the president did not read it out loud to the cameras or to Congress. It was a text that was simply delivered and read aloud to Congress by a clerk. So a very different sort of political ceremony, but nonetheless still an important one. And that's really where this text comes from. But I want to emphasize that this wasn't drafted as a binding doctrine. The three paragraphs, which we now would consider the Monroe Doctrine, if you were to Google it, are not sequential. Okay, they don't come in sequential order. They're scattered throughout this much broader text that just deals with the state of affairs of the Union in 1823. So nobody really knew what they were creating at the time was that important. That's my first point. My second point is that the Monroe Doctrine, or what becomes known as the Monroe Doctrine, was the product of a collective think, groupthink of collective action of the cabinet of James Monroe. We heard a little bit about it when Brooke was describing some of the differences of opinion within that cabinet. The real hawk, the real bullish figure was John C. Calhoun. And Monroe himself, it appears. They were very concerned that an expedition was about to leave Europe to reconquer the new and very fragile Spanish American republics, which had only been recognized by the United States just a year earlier. So there's that side of things, the Monroe cabinet. And as we heard, John Quincy Adams, Secretary of State, has a very different perspective. He, of course, is no fan of the reactionary powers of Europe, but isn't convinced that they're about to engage in something as reckless as a transatlantic military expedition. And even if they were to do that, he doesn't think that it will be a successful maneuver. So his perspective is very different. We have two different perspectives within the cabinet and several opinions somewhere in between that we can see from John Quincy Adams's diary. And how I would describe the text that comes out of this policymaking process is that this text, or what we now call the Monroe Doctrine, is a compromise. It's a compromise between these different perspectives. It's not as if Adams wins out on everything. There is some of that ideologically infused revolutionary language in there towards the Greeks, and also expressions of sympathy, obviously, for the sister republics of Latin America. And there's real muddling on what the policy response is going to be. And here, like all compromises, what you do is you just sort of fudge the differences between one another, and you don't really commit yourself to any action. And for me, that is the key thing to take away from the Monroe Doctrine of 1823, is that it's just a bunch of talk. The United States does not commit itself to any specific foreign policies. The Attorney General in those discussions asks what Adams says is the key question. The key question is, if we announce that the Western Hemisphere is off limits and those European powers decide to intervene anyways, what are we going to do? What are we going to do about it? That question is never answered in 1823, and it's never answered because this is a compromise policy, really more of a compromise document meant for public consumption, because that's what that document is aimed for. One more point on this, and that is, why is it that John C. Calhoun and John Quincy Adams have such different perspectives on the nature of the European threat? Why is Calhoun so terrified, and why is Adams much more confident that the United States will be secure? To me, that's $1 million question. I don't have the answer to it. I can speculate, and I'm okay with historians speculate as long as they come out forthright saying that they're speculating. And my speculation, or my hunch, is it's because John C. Calhoun is viewing foreign affairs through the prism of South Carolina slavery. And he has a heightened perception of threat, external threat, because he's well aware that international turmoil is really, really dangerous for a slave society. This is when you get some of those great slave insurrections in the Atlantic world. Okay, so it wasn't meant as a doctrine. My second point is it's a compromise document that doesn't really commit the United States to anything. And the third point is it doesn't matter at the time in 1823. Whatever the American president says in his annual message might be important for domestic politics. It's certainly important when one looks further down the road. But in the immediate context of 1823, it's British policy, not American policy, which matters. And in a deep irony, the threat of European intervention had already subsided, unbeknownst to the Monroe cabinet when they were having those big debates in November of 1823. It already subsided because the British Foreign Secretary and the French ambassador cut a deal. They cut a deal, and France agreed that it would not intervene in Latin America. Britain, in other words, was what had prevented the European allies from intervening. British policy was the policy that mattered. The American president shouts very loudly of sheltered behind the shield of England. And here we might say that it's a rather shrewd move by Monroe and his Secretary of State to exploit British power in this way and to present themselves to Latin Americans and to the wider world as the saviors of Republican government. And I would say here the last thing to wrap up this point is that what we have is this paradox that we're going to see throughout 19th century hemispheric affairs, in which the United States and Great Britain are collaborating. They kind of agree on what the rules of the game are, but they're also competing with one another for the upper hand, competing with one another in this sense for commercial agreements, political alliances with the new states of Latin America. Okay, now let me conclude by saying, I said there was three kind of problems, three things that were troubling about the Monroe Doctrine as it was conceived. The first thing is its non-committal nature. Because it actually doesn't commit the United States to doing anything, it just announces a set of principles that should govern international relations and the political affairs of the Western Hemisphere without saying what the United States is actually going to do to enforce it. Because it's open-ended, it opens the door to conflicting interpretations within the United States, and also to the exploitation of what's going to become a very powerful symbol of American nationalism. And I think what you see as the 19th century unfolds is American politicians getting ever more adept at presenting their policies in relation to this mythic Monroe Doctrine and saying, what I want is actually the true Monroe Doctrine. What my political enemy wants is not. It's an abrogation of the Monroe Doctrine. I think Teddy Roosevelt does this brilliantly in 1904. He's presenting an imperialist foreign policy in relation to what at the time was an anti-imperialist symbol in American politics. I saw someone in the chat that mentioned Woodrow Wilson. I think that's what Woodrow Wilson is doing, presenting intervention in the First World War, the League of Nations, saying that this is an extension of the Monroe Doctrine. I think there's no way that that's actually the case, but it's a savvy political move. And this is really the history of the Monroe Doctrine, is the history of this domestic politicking. The second thing I think that is troubling about the Monroe Doctrine over time is that if the United States is going to proclaim a sphere of influence, as it effectively does in 1823, and then certainly builds upon that moving forward, if it's going to declare a sphere of influence, it opens the door for other powers to do the same in their regions. This would be another way of tracking or tracing the history of the Monroe Doctrine after 1823, would be to watch how the United States expands its sphere of influence, expands it over time until you get to Wilson saying the whole world is part of the Monroe Doctrine, but then looking at how other rival powers either proclaim their own Monroe Doctrine. You see this in Australia. You see this, of course, with the Japanese. The Japanese, when Japanese expansionism and the buildup of the Second World War, that's presented as a Japanese Monroe Doctrine. You see the Soviets doing this in the days of the Cold War. And I think it's very difficult for the United States to say, well, you can't do that, but we can. And that's just an inherent problem or tension within the doctrine itself. And then the final thing I will say, and this is by no means a slight on James Monroe. I don't think that James Monroe is the problem here. I think it's subsequent executives or American presidents. But the final problem is that connecting a doctrine and a foreign policy to a president is problematic given the Constitution's power that's accorded to the legislative branch of the government. Big problem for American foreign policy making moving forward into the 19th century, and Lord knows, into the 20th and 21st, is the emergence of the imperial presidency, a vast executive apparatus that has immense, astonishing foreign policy powers. And it's all good and well when your guy's in the White House, when the guy that you like's in the White House, but when the other guy wins the election, it's very, very problematic. And it's very, very problematic, particularly in our time when the parties are so polarized and have such different visions of how America should conduct its relations to the wider world. Now, Monroe didn't cause this problem, but by connecting a foreign policy to the executive branch, one can see how that problem metastasized over time. Thank you very much.
And thank you. So I'm going to start out with a question of my own. I will remind, however, everybody, please put your questions in. Many of you have been. Please put in some more. This is the question about, how quickly does the Monroe Doctrine become recognized, consciously, within Washington as part of the diplomatic establishment and its traditions by the American public, by foreign publics. And I guess one way I would put this more concretely is, so when the French invade Mexico in 1862, while we're busy with our Civil War, are they aware of the Monroe Doctrine as they formulate their own decisions to go in? To anyone?
I'll take that real quick. Of course they are, but they're aware that that the United States isn't in a position to prevent that expedition. But I would say that that's not a unique episode. I mean, the British take the Malvinas Falkland Islands in the 1830s. That's absolutely a violation of what Monroe said would be America's policy. The United States has essentially no problem with that. No problem with that because American interest is for British control of those strategic become coaling stations. At that time were whaling ports. And the British were more friendly to American commercial interests than were the Argentines. So I would say there's also this long tradition of, if you want to know who invokes the Monroe Doctrine the most, particularly in, say, a quarter century after 1823, it's not the United States, it's Latin Americans. It's the new Spanish Americans appealing to the United States, saying, hey, this is what your president said. The British just took our islands. What are you going to do about it? And that's also the case in the 1860s. It's the Mexican liberal regime who invokes the Monroe Doctrine. Abraham Lincoln and William Henry Seward, the great statesman of the Civil War North, never mentioned the word in the 1860s. So this becomes someone said it's a living document. It's absolutely a living document, and it's one that's not at all contained or controlled by the United States. It's out and about in the air in Latin America, and the history of the doctrine has to include Latin American invocations as well as those of the United States.
That's actually, so when we start having our Roosevelt corollaries and so on, this is in some ways building upon the Latin American tradition of building up, invoking the Monroe Doctrine during the previous decades. Well, that was a question, but
did you want to come in on that, Brooke or anybody?
Well, I wasn't going to comment on that. I was actually going to ask. I don't want to go off, but I was going to ask about the not using the Monroe Doctrine term during the Civil War, and this is a little past my period, but that's purposeful, correct? They don't want to inflame European sentiment, right? So they're probably thinking about it, but they specifically don't use the term. I think is that right? I think there's several incidents there where they're trying to avoid that term because they think it'll inflame European sentiment on the issue of, say, the Mexican Civil War.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's a tactical decision, and it's also rooted in readings of domestic politics, that it's the enemies of the Lincoln administration who are banging on about the Monroe Doctrine, and to use that would seem to seed the ground to your domestic political enemies in an election year. That's when you see a lot of talk about it in 1864. I would just say the Roosevelt corollary, I wouldn't quite link it to the Latin American reading, because of course there's the Drago Doctrine. Okay, then this is when you get other countries creating their own doctrines that are kind of counters to it. And this is the Argentine Doctrine, which is meant to solve or settle that problem of European gunboat diplomacy in a way that avoids unilateral American intervention. So it's loosely connected in that sense, but I wouldn't draw a straight line to Teddy Roosevelt from the Latin Americans.
I want to select a question from somebody else. Mike Goodman, this is actually just to go way forward. Did the Cuban Missile Crisis spell the end of the Monroe Doctrine? And I'm throwing that out there just, this is, it's not something which came to an end of the 19th century. It really matters through to pretty recent American foreign policy.
I'll take a stab if that's okay, David. I think it's a great question, but I think the Monroe Doctrine was, and I just alluded to this really briefly in my talk. What in the debate over the League of Nations, for instance, in the U.S., people like Henry Cabot Lodge, well, we're okay with the League, but we need a reservation that the Monroe Doctrine is going to be kept. And the problem with that is it makes absolutely no sense whatsoever to have a League of Nations with the mandate of the League of Nations and then say, but America has a special role in the Americas that other nations don't have. And I think you see, so if my recollection is right, and I'm no expert on this, but I've taught it a few times, Kennedy never mentions it. He instead talks about universal norms, which really makes sense given the context of the entire Cold War and really World War II and after order, I think. So it was another nail. And how raise the Monroe Doctrine when we have nuclear missiles in Turkey? That's just as close to Russia as Cuba is to the southern part of the U.S. So it's kind of awkward.
During those debates, as the Kennedy administration is muddling its way through the Cuban crisis in 1962, one of the advisors turns to him and says, "Oh, President, hey, it's time to invoke the Monroe Doctrine." And Kennedy says, "Monroe Doctrine? What in the hell's that?"
Actually, may I then follow up? Am I correct to think that we have not formally revoked the Monroe Doctrine? And we still have this as American policy. And indeed, actually, the question I would also ask about the Roosevelt corollary, just to follow up.
They've all been revoked by one administration or the other. There's the famous Clark Memorandum for 1928, which is a sort of precursor to FDR's good neighbor policy, which explicitly disavows the Roosevelt corollary. There was a speech by John Kerry in the days of Barack Obama, back when Kerry was Obama's Secretary of State, he said, the Monroe Doctrine is dead. It's over. This was an attempt to appeal to the Latin American delegation. I believe this was a speech in front of the OAS, the Organization of American States. Of course, the point is, Kerry said that. We were just talking before we got on here. It wasn't but 2 years ago in the days of Donald Trump that John Bolton gave a speech about invoking the Monroe Doctrine in relation to the instability and political crisis in Venezuela. So I think, anyways, that's my point. One administration does one thing, then the following one does another. And that, if you're following the history of the Monroe Doctrine over time, that's what emerges. It's not a linear story. It's not a clear line. It's not a a clear, clean narrative. It is a zigzag that is all over the place.
Can I add something, maybe, or sort of a question? That's exactly right, and very helpful summary of that zigzag of how this goes. But we still do. I mean, we're talking now. I don't know if this will happen. We're talking about intervening in Haiti again, given recent events. Now, I don't think anybody's going to cite the Monroe Doctrine to do it, but it seems as if you kind of get the Roosevelt corollary on and off, whether you've disavowed, whether it's the Dominican Republic or Cuba, Haiti many times. I can't, since I think 1915, but within our own lifetime several times. And so maybe Jay, you'd want to talk about that, or really, but Brooke too, I'd be happy to hear.
Well, I was kind of thinking of it, both of what you were just saying, John, something Jay said earlier about, the issue of when you create a executive branch doctrine, which of course, Monroe was definitely not doing. Monroe didn't have this is 1817. He doesn't even have a legislative agenda. I mean, it just does. So I think that's why I've always been struck by what I talked about, this statement of support, right? We believe in these things as the United States. Republicanism, maybe, representative government, something, whatever he was trying to say, right? We believe in representation, and so I think it makes it all the more clear that when other presidents are invoking the Monroe Doctrine for very specific and at times very different foreign policy adventures or agenda, whatever, it just isn't at all and it makes it more absurd, the arguments. Well, no, this is really what Monroe was saying. He was not saying any of that. I mean, he just wasn't. There's no way to look at the nature of the presidency, particularly the Democratic Republican presidency in that period, and say this is meant to be not just, I don't even mean just an aggressive foreign policy, but it's not even really meant to be a foreign policy agenda, because those presidents defer to the legislature. That was just what you did as a president in the pre, I guess, Jackson, I suppose. I mean, probably not Washington as much. He was annoyed sometimes when he did. But so, I mean, to me, that's the universal, I think Monroe would say that was the universal nature of the Monroe Doctrine, not whether we're going to intervene in Cuba, because there's a movement there. We'll intervene in a pro-democracy movement, these last couple of weeks, but we won't intervene in Iran a few years ago, right? That's not what Monroe would say. Monroe would say is the United States, and this is silly to think about what Monroe would say in 2020, but whatever. He would say, we just say we support these things. We support Republican government. Today he'd probably say we support democracy. So I think that's the way to look at it. If you want to take anything universal from it, look at it in that way, not in specific foreign policy agenda.
I have a different question I will go to unless other people want to follow up on that. So mine is a popular culture question, and I'm going to hook it on a famed Confederate general, Simon Bolivar Bruckner, named after Simon Bolivar, shortly after, and which indicates some level of popular interest in Latin America. And I'm sort of using that to ask, how much is the Monroe Doctrine reflecting popular affection and interest for the other Latin American countries? How much is this an elite project, which is acquiesced by the vast American majority, who couldn't give two sticks for Venezuela and Colombia? To anyone?
Well, it's harder to say in that period than it would be today. The probably most famously, and this is still elite, but it's the closest I can get. Henry Clay was throughout Monroe's administration he used the question of Latin American independence as a cudgel against the administration. I mean, I think Henry Clay did believe in Latin American independence and republicanism, but he also was a little annoyed that he hadn't been chosen as Secretary of State. And so he used this to build up his political, basically used it to build up a kind of almost, there's no opposition parties really in Monroe's administration, but Clay is kind of the closest thing you've got to a loyal opposition at the time. So I think he's at least, Clay being a decent politician, no, not always that adept, he's at least building on some sort of popular movement. There's certainly some of that in the water in the United States in that period, for sure.
Yeah, I think
revolution, I don't think at the time. Go ahead.
I think there's immense bottom-up interest and indeed political pressure related to these foreign revolutions. You can see it in a number of ways. Just go around mid-Missouri where I now live. All the towns named after sites from the Latin American revolutions. Someone just put in that Jackson named his one of his horses, Bolivar. You can see it also. I mean, the related one is, of course, the Greek Revolution against the Ottomans at the same time, the Greek Fire, as it was called at the time. And this was not just something that like elite Harvard professors that taught Greek, like Edward Everett, were interested in. This was something that reached into all social classes and indeed geographic regions. And we actually just finished a review of a jolly good book on the Greek Fire. I think it's called The Greek Fire, and I can't remember the author's name, but was making the point about the immense popular interest in the Greek Revolution. There's, of course, a similar book about the Latin American revolutions by someone called Caitlin Fitz, Our Sister Republics, if you guys want reading lists. So immense popular interest. Here, if I can be a little critical of James Monroe, I could say that, you know, the thing about the Monroe Doctrine, the text, is that it provides symbolic cover or support for that position. It's saying, yes, I believe in revolutions. Yes, I believe in the Greek Revolution. Absolutely. But I'm not going to do anything about it. I'm not going to do anything about it. My Secretary of State is just on my case. I can't get the guy off my back. That's part of the reason. Also, all of the commercial interests of New England, they don't give two hoots and a holler about the Greek Revolution. They want to cut that trade deal with the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottomans have already said there's no trade deal if you recognize Greek independence. So what Monroe is actually doing in this case, and I wouldn't single him out, I mean, Daniel Webster would be another example of this. What American officials, statesmen are doing is that they're giving lip service. They're raising the expectations that the U.S. government is standing side by side these revolutionary movements, but they're not actually doing anything about it. They're not actually doing anything about it. I mean, that would be a criticism of them. You could come back at me and say, but hey, it works. Look at Greece. Greece gets its independence, and you get that trade deal with the Ottoman Empire by 1830. So you achieve both of your objectives. It takes a little bit longer. That's shrewd, savvy realism. That's John Quincy Adams at his best. But so that's a long-winded answer to say, you betcha, this is a bottom-up story. This is a democratic political culture in 1820s America. It's not quite what it's going to be a few decades later, but foreign policy is not just something that's the product of an elite establishment.
Other people want to contribute to that? Okay, I'm going to go to a question from James W. Muller, and I will take the moment to say, actually, I am using his book to help support me. He has edited The River War by Winston Churchill, the complete edition, a marvelous book, which everybody should read. Shout out. His question is, what was the reaction of legislators and other political officials in the United States to Monroe's annual message with respect to what we now call the Monroe Doctrine?
I can go first. I think that the immediate reaction is one of, if not unanimous, of near unanimous support. Henry Clay says, in relation to the president's message, we are all Federalists, we are all Republicans, quoting the Jefferson line. That's the immediate reaction. But if you just extend the analysis, a couple of months into 1824, 1825, 1826, a lot of these unresolved questions about what does this actually mean become legislative questions. And the sequel to this is the big debates in Congress about whether or not the United States should be a party to the Panama Congress, this hemispheric gathering organized by Bolivar, in which the questions about how these new republics would relate to one another, how they would relate to the British Empire, what the commercial economic structures, political ideas would be, would there be things like freedom of religion in the Western Hemisphere? All these big questions. Would Haiti be recognized? Could you recognize a Black revolutionary republic? All these big questions, which Monroe's message didn't answer at all, are raised by a foreign power, by Bolivar, and the legislature debates what to do. And it's this long-winded series of debates that don't really come to a conclusion, but begin that broader discussion about what the actual policies and the meaning of the Monroe Doctrine is going to be, other than an adherence to that revolutionary ideology, which Brooks talked about, which I absolutely agree, that if there is a heart and soul to it, that's it. But what does it mean beyond that? Unresolved.
Professor Poston, Professor Grand? I will then go to another question, in this case in the Q&A. Sarah Fishkin, what forces viewed the doctrine as a way of keeping foreign powers out of the hemisphere in order to enable the United States to expand its power?
What forces or what individuals?
Sorry, what forces? You can answer it as what individuals if you would prefer.
I guess I think that's the typical reading at the time. That's the typical reading for how John Quincy Adams viewed it. At least the way I look at it is, John Quincy Adams is the more hard-headed realist of the two between he and Monroe. Moving forward, I suppose Polk would be an example later. He is the one who resurrects the Monroe Doctrine for California and Oregon, or he called it Monroes Doctrine, right? He was the first one to really use that term. So there would be two, and then I think moving forward there are no shortage of examples, so, which maybe John or Jay can talk about.
Professor Sexton?
So the question is, who sees this as a call for U.S. imperialism and expansion?
Yeah.
I mean, James K. Polk, absolutely. And he's not often thought of as a savvy sort of political operator, but in this sense, shrewdly invoking a popular address from a president from a pre-partisan era, or an era of imagined good feelings, and using that as cover for his deeply divisive foreign policy, a deeply divisive foreign policy. I think you see Stephen Douglas doing this in the 1850s. Absolutely, Stephen Douglas presents his kind of muscular, kind of proto-TR foreign policy, presents it in relation to the Monroe Doctrine. But I would say that when you get to the late 19th century, that what you see is actually the opposite, that those who most often use the Monroe Doctrine, at least before Teddy Roosevelt, are the anti-imperialists. If you look at the debates in 1898 about if the United States should annex the former Spanish colonies of the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam, and take control of Cuba, when the Monroe Doctrine comes into those debates, it's used by the anti-imperialist as justification for not taking that step. So it is a symbol of expansion and intervention and imperialism, but it also remains a symbol of a kind of backward-looking, conservative old foreign policy of limiting commitments, of pursuing Republican principles and not playing the game of the old world. I mean, after all, that is what Monroe wanted, right? He didn't want to become like one of those European imperial monarchical powers. And I think that the old timers, I say they're old timers because you look at the anti-imperialists in 1898, the 12 leading anti-imperialists, their average age is 69. So these are old guys from an earlier generation. The old timers, I think, get that. They remember that. They remember what was at the core of that message of 1823.
I am going to go, given a significant silence. I'm actually there's an interesting cat among the pigeons question from Thomas West, which is in effect, he's assuming disagreement among the panelists. And I'll just read this for people. Grant's distinction between the pre-1898 and the post-1898 application of the doctrine is implicitly rejected by the other panelists. The other panelists argue for a zigzag non-pattern with changes from one administration to another. Grant claims the US mostly followed a pattern of non-intervention in Europe and limited its involvement in the Western Hemisphere to counteractions selectively of European involvement in our hemisphere. And Grant implies the TR corollary was not just a shift in interpretation, but a rejection of the original doctrine. Other panelists seem to disagree. Now, before we get here, obviously this gets into the possibility that people here will say, oh no, we don't disagree with one another. We're all one big happy. I guess want to rephrase that slightly. Would it be correct to say that there are historiographical distinctions between people who do see a continuity in American foreign policy, and the Monroe Doctrine, from 1823 to the present, people who see a strong split between, around 1898, and perhaps people who think we have a foreign policy we should not analyze in terms of this Monroe Doctrine at all? And in fact, would it be correct to say that these are different historiographical schools as ways of analyzing? If so, what are the strengths and weaknesses? And then two, you can say that one or the other of you is a horrible person who needs to be beaten up right now. John Grant, you have implicitly been rejected by the other people. What do you say?
I think it's right to say the original Monroe Doctrine was revolutionary in the sense of the moral question, advocating revolution, being in favor of Republican government. And perhaps I emphasize more the difference with the later view, which, the Roosevelt corollary, but really just the later view, simply the post-1898 view, which just absolutely dominates American politics in the sense of coming out on top. Of course, there have been people who disagree with this, and but that say we need to have spread democracy, and we'll use U.S. power to do so, whether that's force or economic power, or I think the earlier view was not just accidentally opposed to that, but essentially in the sense of how can you force another people to be free, or how can you make them or coerce them into that? That's where I would come down.
Professor Poston?
Yeah, I guess I don't see as much. I mean, most of what I do is, leading up to the doctrine. Like, I guess as we were sitting here discussing, I didn't see as much of a break in the way we see things as the person who asked the question. But I suppose some of it is just, who knows what Polk would have done, or Seward would have done if they'd had the economic and military capabilities of a Teddy Roosevelt or Woodrow Wilson. I mean, I suppose there's a question of politics is what is possible, right? Certainly in Monroe's era, they're not marching, armies, military down to Latin America to kick out the Spanish or to stop the British. So if there's a break, if there's a lack of continuity, I think some of it is just the fact that the United States is so much more powerful a century later, or even a half century later, post-Civil War and into the 20th century.
Yeah, you took the words out of my mouth there, actually. I mean, I think that it depends on how we look at it. If we want to look at this as just a kind of set of ideas of political thought, what Monroe says, and then kind of trace it down to what other people say, I guess I would tend to maybe agree that there's more continuity, albeit expansion of the application of those ideas. And seems like John Grant's critical of that turn, perfectly legitimate position. But I would say it's not a complete repudiation. It's just saying, you know, liberty and republicanism, we're for non-intervention. But if you keep beating your chest about that, at some point, I suppose you're going to run into that question about what that actually means. And different administrations come down differently on that, and we can agree or disagree with those decisions. But I guess I don't really look at foreign policy history in that way. I think I look at it in relation to the way in which the United States organizes and structures its power, and the way in which it chooses to project that power abroad. And when you look at it that way, I just don't think that there is as much continuity in U.S. foreign policy history as we tend to assume, and that's because of the revolutionary changes in the amount of power that the United States has. And of course, power only matters in a relative sense. The relative power that the United States has vis-a-vis other powers, and how that shifts and changes. So that's what I would emphasize. I would guess that does loosely map up, to answer your question, David, on different ways of slicing and dicing the U.S. past, and how some people line up. Do they think the ideas are what we should follow, or do they think that the hard power and their applications what should matter? I think that's a long, kind of distinguished old debate. Long may that debate continue, actually, in the historiography. But that's why you might be hearing, or that's why our questioner right there might be hearing us coming from different vantages on this.
Responses? I'm actually going to follow up a little bit on this. How much is the foreign policy of the Monroe Doctrine being done with an intelligent anticipation that the United States will become more powerful? I mean, this is part of the idea, you know, the United States doing this in order to expand its power. How much is it anticipating, you know, James Monroe, looking backwards, he knows how much more powerful the United States has become between the time he was a young man and the time he's president. If he can look forward and say, in a similar amount of time, our power will commercial, et cetera, will appreciate in proportion, should we not be making foreign policy in anticipation of that increased growth of power? How much of this intelligent anticipation of the future is there in the formulation of the Monroe Doctrine?
I would say for Monroe, I can speak to the easiest. John Quincy Adams might be slightly different, but very, very little. I don't see this as I don't see this as a doctrine. I don't see this as a way to shape American foreign policy. Some of the stuff I said before, that's not the role. Even though the executive had more power in foreign policy than domestic in 1823, it still had far. I mean, I can't put enough far less than say today.
Right.
But I think this is, as Jay mentioned, this is a reaction to what's going on the ground, to stuff that's happened before, and at best, he wants everyone around the world to know that the United States stands for republicanism. What that means, what that'll mean in practical terms, we'll get to that later, or maybe not. But if we just say it like we have been fearful, like he would say, Jay and Hamilton were fearful of saying it before because they were secret monarchists, right? If we just say it, that's a good step. So yeah, I don't see any. I mean, it would take a real visionary, and John Quincy Adams maybe is a little to some extent, but it'd take a real visionary to anticipate that in the future. I don't think foreign policy is really done like that I think it's seat of your pants kind of stuff for the most part. That would be my answer. And if the two panelists disagree, that's fine.
I don't disagree with Brooke. I think the document as written document, I mean, it was not a document, obviously, as Jay points out, in the sense some people take it to be, but what's taken to be the doctrine is certainly open to U.S. expansion and would aid insofar on the continent, especially because you're keeping, if that orientation is followed out, you're keeping out these serious threats. Jay also mentioned the concern with Russians in the Pacific West. I mean, well, why would you care? I mean, look at where America is in 1823. It seemed, well, that's a long way away, but well, really, that's the. But I don't think there was a thought of. I think Brooke is right. It's not a clever scheme to facilitate expansion.
The long-term kind of political vision that I'd emphasize is less a sort of foreign policy vision than it is just the idea of the Union itself, and a recognition of the Union's fragility. Don't forget, we've just gone through the Missouri crisis. I guess your audience has just gone through the Missouri crisis as well. Just gone through the very, very near crisis, internal crisis at the Hartford Convention in the days of the War of 1812. I mean, separatism, whether it be the North-South slavery divide or New England, or whether it be settlers in the Trans-Appalachian West wanting to detach themselves from the Union, that is totally on the mind of the formulators of the Monroe Doctrine in 1823. If you read John Quincy Adams's diary time and time again, they just come back to these fears, which seems so out of place to us because we kind of take it as a given. This is the era of good feelings. This is the era, the apogee of nationalism in the early 19th century. But what they're concerned about is some kind of international turmoil, a European intervention in Cuba or something like that would create a hemispheric crisis that would be incredibly destabilizing and could rip the Union apart. And that's because of those things that they just experienced. And I would go back to slavery. It's because of slavery. It's not a coincidence that Calhoun and Monroe from slave states are the ones that have such a heightened and such an acute perception of threat. And I think that they're right to, in the sense that international turmoil and slavery do not go well together. That's the history of the age of revolutions. It's incredibly destabilizing to a closed slave system. So you have different perceptions of threat. But I think that the long-term vision, to the extent that there is one, kind of comes down to the Union, to Union, rather than to how we would think of it today as foreign policy, more traditionally defined.
Thank you. I'm going to follow up then with a question from Chance Layton of the NAS. Does that later understanding of the Monroe Doctrine, post-1898, and American foreign policy to enforce democracy around the world come from continental philosophers? I'm thinking of Kant's cosmopolitan ideal. Or is the post-1898 foreign policy less moral, less cosmopolitan, and more realist policy? And I'm just going to add to that, I'll just throw in the name of Woodrow Wilson as a sort of a modernizing German-influenced thinker of that era, as somebody who might be coming in with this sort of a new view of foreign policy.
I would say that the general consensus, and of course it's dangerous to speak of such a thing, and you're ignoring a lot of nuances, is vaguely Kantian or Hegelian, although did Teddy Roosevelt, for instance, read Hegel? People fight about that, but I don't see, it's not as if he read it as or any of these people, even Wilson, read these people as, oh, I've read Kant's Perpetual Peace, or et cetera, so now I must go out and do a League of Nations. I mean, that wasn't, but in general, they did think our society should aim at uplifting people at home and abroad. And so a big impetus, not the sole, but a big impetus for the segregation movement at home, which really took off in the 1890s, was that same ideal, very much connected with we should do this. McKinley said, well, we have to help my little brown brothers abroad. And that might mean shooting them, probably about 110,000 in the Philippines, but by golly, we're also send school teachers. There's a great book, I can't remember the author, Crags and school books, after the Army rifle of the time. The two things we sent to the Philippines, the soldiers with the Krag Jorgensen rifle and lots of nice school teachers to help those Filipinos become uplifted. And I think that was the more, and sometimes I'll just mention one episode, they would sacrifice realistic considerations. I mean, everyone knows about the disaster in the Philippines in 1941 and early 1942, but that was foreseen in the early 1900s when we were in the Philippines. The Japanese were mad at us for a variety of reasons: our immigration policy, great power politics, helping their perception we came down on the side of the Russians in the negotiations about the Russo-Japanese War. And there was a question, should we abandon the Philippines as a dangerous spot? And William Howard Taft convinced TR, no, we need to stay there because we've got a moral obligation to uplift these people and help them. So I would say more idealist and less realist, in short.
Professor Poston, Professor Sexton. Nope. All right. Professor Grant has answered for the panel. It is the word from on high. I'm going to go back to a question which was actually asked an hour ago from Doc Broom, which relates actually here. Can someone address Wilson and Carl Becker's appeal to the Monroe Doctrine as justifying the entry to the First World War? The case being that the Monroe Doctrine was really about the protection and expansion of democracy, and perhaps this tie into the development of the Messiah nation concept.
Well, that's a good kind of dots that are connected there by the questioner. I mean, I would take maybe a slightly more cynical read on Wilson's invocation of the doctrine. I mean, of course, he does it in two separate ways, doesn't he? The first is in the mold of his erstwhile political enemy, Teddy Roosevelt. I mean, it's the days of Woodrow Wilson when you see the most interventions in the Caribbean. We might say, to be fair, that it's the context rather than the individual. I mean, this is when the wheels really fall off in terms of the stability of a lot of these places. This is when you have the intervention in Haiti and the Dominican Republic, of course, in Mexico, the Mexican Revolution, a titanic event. Soon thereafter, you're going to have intervention in Nicaragua as well. So that invocation of the doctrine, I think, is probably what the questioner is implying and what comes out of the Roosevelt administration. The cynical take on it is that, of course, when he's talking about the Monroe Doctrine for the world, if I'm not mistaken, that's the Peace Without Victory speech. He's at first trying to present a vision for what's going to come out of this calamity of the Great War, trying to mobilize some kind of domestic mandate for what he's going to do, and then when we get into the actual period of intervention and peacemaking in the war and immediately after, the Monroe Doctrine comes up, and I think here's the cynical invocation. It's simply to appease internal domestic critics. I mean, I think that's what he's doing. He knows he needs votes. He needs votes for the post-war treaty, for the entry to the League of Nations, and he's got a group of irreconcilables, about a dozen, that aren't going to vote for him no matter what. But he's got a larger group of internationalist Republicans and conservative Democrats in his own party that might be persuaded to vote, and they're the ones banging on about the Monroe Doctrine. So he's throwing them some red meat. It's mostly rhetorical. He tries to work it actually into the text of the League of the Nations itself, but as someone already pointed out, it just wouldn't really work. I mean, there's all sorts of question marks about what that actually meant, and if you were opening the door to the very type of imperial rivalries and competition that you were trying to avoid with the League of Nations. So it's very problematic, but hey, this is what happens for an American president. That's a tough job when you have to deal with foreign players, but also all the vicissitudes of internal politics. And I think that's probably what explains Wilson's Monroe Doctrine more than anything else.
I gotta have a follow-up. How much is the Truman Doctrine merely invoking the word doctrine for continuity, and how much is the Truman Doctrine actually sort of an intellectual heir of the Monroe Doctrine?
Love it, man. That's a great question. Love it. Love that question. I mean, first, let's just say, hey, something new's happening, because even his predecessor, FDR, everybody beforehand, when they wanted to invoke some kind of a doctrine, they'd invoke the Monroe Doctrine. Just, oh, Greenland is part of our sphere of influence. That's what FDR says as the Battle of the Atlantic is raging. Or they invoke a corollary, as Teddy Roosevelt did. But it's always connected to this like mythic doctrine from 1823. Truman kind of, he's the game changer in that he's the first one to create his own doctrine. And if I'm not mistaken, everybody since has done that, or at least sought to do that. So that's the good first point. Second point, very much in the vein of his predecessors, even if he doesn't shield himself in Monroe, he's still invoking a doctrine mostly for domestic political purposes. He's trying to say, here's a coherent vision. It links to American national values. Now appropriate those funds that we need to fight communism in Greece and Turkey. We need legislative action on this, and I need the funds. Very much what you would see other American presidents doing. So I see it in a vein, in a domestic political vein. Perhaps I'll leave it to the others to comment on if they think the sort of global anti-communism, which the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan in that era announced, whether they think that's an extension, a logical extension of Monroe in 1823, or they think that this is a sharp turn, a veer off from the path that the great man had set for the nation. I'd be curious to hear what they say on that.
Yeah, that is a hard question, because on one hand you can see, as I mentioned before, about the monarchy versus republicanism, you can see how Monroe would have wanted to support democratic regimes or Republican regimes. At first, when you said that, I was wondering. My first thought was, yeah, why didn't he just call it the Truman corollary? And that led me to thinking, well, it is a little more in terms of its aggressiveness, like the Roosevelt corollary, than it is the original Monroe Doctrine. But yeah, I find that to be I think there's some through lines there, but I find that to be an interesting question. I don't know why he didn't. I mean, this is, we're into the 20th century. This is way outside of my what I usually do. I don't know why he didn't just call it the Truman corollary. Was that considered? I would assume it had to have been. Everybody else, like you said, Jay, used Monroe Doctrine, and the ability to link it back to something which can be at this point whatever the heck you want it to be, right? That seems more, I don't know, maybe it's ego. I don't know. Sounds cool, Truman Doctrine. I don't know. That's my 18th and 19th century historian muddling through answering that question.
Professor Grant?
I saw an earlier comment or a question that about spheres of influence that might, which of course, and this came up earlier. I think Jay brought this up. You have this problem with the Monroe Doctrine, or a problem from a certain perspective is, well, if the U.S. can have a sphere of influence, why can't other nations? And I think it was a way back in the question. So, well, yeah, what about that? Maybe, and so you of course de facto you have this with the Cold War. You obviously have spheres of influence, but the original idea was you wouldn't have spheres of influence. The original post-war order was the U.S. and the USSR were in broad agreement, was the idea. I mean, this is, to look back is to say, how could that how could any serious human being have thought that? But I think there was a lot of evidence that the people who were at least supposed to be serious did think it, and that you're not going to have spheres of influence, and you'll have world management by the great powers for ends such as the four freedoms, in general. And there's an argument for that approach, which is, well, you have these problems of autocracy, of fascism, of communism, these great world problems in a technological way. There's many, important and intelligent accounts why you have to have things differently, but it is a radical reorientation away from, and the real problem is, I think, that has to be faced is it democratic at all when you're managing the rest of the world? At least insofar as your power allows you to do it at that moment. So yes, if the Soviets are resisting you, then in the Eastern Bloc, et cetera, and the other satellite nations, that's not going to happen. But and people will talk about the coups we sponsor or what have you, that kind of thing, and really still going on. I mean, think of the intense U.S. concern about what goes on in the Black Sea. I mean, okay, there's an argument for that, right? That relates to stop this or really bad things will happen in the future, to summarize. But it is, I think, a very radical aid to Greece and Turkey. I mean, where a passionate concern for Turkey, okay, but pretty striking.
Yeah, perhaps they didn't call it the Truman Corollary because there might have been a historian at the time, a chap called Dexter Perkins, who wrote about the Monroe Doctrine in days gone by. He would have known. He would have said, actually, that's not a corollary. James Monroe expressed solidarity with the revolutions in Latin America and Greece, but he didn't ask Congress for $400 million. He didn't commit the United States to a global policy of containment, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I happen to think that those were good things that Truman did, incidentally, but it certainly wasn't the Monroe Doctrine. I mean, the difference there, and that's where we get to this. I suppose we've come to this point in several different bits of the conversation, whereas we might see continuities in the ideas, the ideology, the embrace of republicanism, and let's not forget we could say that there's continuity of a darker sort too. I mean, there's the racist thinking that underlies both conceptions of Latin American revolutions in the 1820s and American foreign policy thereafter. So there's both good ideas, bad ideas, but there's some real continuity through them. But yet the actual mechanisms of policy making, the way in which the United States interfaces with the wider world, and the extent to which it projects its power abroad is so totally different that it really makes no sense to try to tell a linear story. And so we've come to this at several points. I don't actually know where I stand on this, but I don't normally talk to people that make that case for the ideological continuity. So I've enjoyed listening to that very, very much today, indeed.
Thank you. Now it's actually 3:28. I'm just going to toss out something you won't even have a chance to react to. That the open door policy might be a more Monroevian continuity in the 1890s than our emerging policy in Latin America. No chance to discuss it. I'm going to ask each of you if you would just have a minute to say some last words, conclusion, and then I'll sort of wrap up. Reverse alphabetical order this time. Professor Sexton.
Oh, well, I'll use my minute to pick up that thread on the open door. Sorry. I think that would be a very clear connection, because of course, what's the open door call for? Non-annexation, the territorial integrity of China, and it calls for open commercial access, no preferential trading agreements, don't box American commerce out. That's what the administration of Monroe is seeking in Latin America in the 1820s. So, and also one other continuity is they're not really prepared to do anything about it in China in 1899, 1900, and they're relying on British power to enforce the open door. I mean, that's also an Anglo-American condominium. I mean, that's a British policy as well as an American one. So actually, I think that the continuities there are really striking and profound. I haven't thought about that before, even though they're in different geographic regions. So well done, David Randall. That was a great question at the end.
Thank you. Professor Poston.
I guess I'll just take my last minute to do what I should have done earlier and just thank John, Jay, you, David, Chance, and Chris for having us on. And I just say I really enjoyed this conversation, and I learned a lot, actually. So thank you.
And I'm sorry I didn't have more questions about the lead up to Monroe. All the stuff that happened later was terribly unfair. Professor Grant.
Yeah, I'd like to echo what Brooke said. Thank you. It's been very informative. I've learned a lot and enjoyed the opportunity to be here. And riffing a little bit more on the open door issue, I think, and I don't have really so much knowledge is knowledge that there's a problem or lack of knowledge on my part, at least, and maybe there's a literature on this I just don't know about. But is you have a growing interconnected world economy that really demands a sort of uniformity in many ways. How can you have any kind of meaningful political differences? So the open door, no territorial annexation by foreign powers, but as part of, you're going to be open to our goods. That's, this is the way this should be. I think there's a lot of work to be done there. Close with a thought on future thinking. So
lovely. Well, thank you all so very much. I'll just repeat to everybody who is watching, it will be available. You can hear this all watch it again on our National Association of Scholars YouTube channel. If you have any follow-up questions, please direct them to me at randall@nas.org. And I'll be glad to pass them on. We will be continuing this series in weeks to come. We have both our American history webinar series, and good heavens, I'm forgetting what's the next one we're moderating. Maybe you can be put into chat quickly, but we will be doing the American history series. We'll be doing the American literature series as well, both of them through the summer and into the colder months as they come out afterwards into the new year. We are going forward from the Great Awakening will be our next one after this one. So the Great Awakening is next. And I hope everyone will come back for that. So again, thank everyone. Thank you so much for participating as panelists, for listening, and for participating as audience.